Star Trek 1966 20 Weird Facts You Didn't Know. In the fall of 1966, a strange little television show about a starship crew quietly premiered on NBC. Nobody involved thought they were making history. The sets wobbled. The aliens were often just actors in repainted costumes. The special effects budget wouldn't cover a modern smartphone commercial. And yet, 6 decades later, that show is still shaping how we think about the future, about technology, and about each other. Star Trek shouldn't have worked. Here are 20 strange, surprising, and largely forgotten stories from behind the scenes of the show that refused to die. 1. The captain almost wasn't Kirk. Before William Shatner ever set foot on the bridge of the Enterprise, the role of captain belonged to someone else entirely. Actor Jeffrey Hunter played Captain Christopher Pike in the very first pilot episode, a moody and introspective take on command that leaned heavily into philosophy rather than action. NBC executives watched that pilot and decided it wasn't right for television audiences. Rather than shelving the whole project, they did something almost unheard of. They ordered a second pilot. By that point, Hunter had moved on, and the producers turned to a Canadian stage actor with a flair for the dramatic. Shatner brought a very different energy to the role, more impulsive, more physical, more willing to throw a punch or fall in love in the same episode. It's strange to imagine Star Trek without him, but for a brief moment, an entirely different actor held the fate of the franchise in his hands. 2. Spock wasn't supposed to look like Spock. Mr. Spock's calm green-tinted features and pointed ears are instantly recognizable today, but the character almost looked radically different. Early concept art considered giving Spock a much more sinister, reddish complexion, something closer to a devil than a scientist. The idea was scrapped for a very practical reason. Most television sets in 1966 still broadcast in black and white, and a reddish skin tone would have registered as an unsettling, muddy dark shade on screen. Producers worried that audiences would associate the character with something demonic rather than alien and intelligent. The compromise was a subtler tint that read as otherworldly without being frightening, and it worked so well that when color broadcasts became standard, most viewers barely noticed the shift. 3. The transporter was a budget trick. One of the most celebrated pieces of technology in all of science fiction wasn't dreamed up by a physicist or a futurist. It was invented because the show couldn't afford to film a spaceship landing every week. Early scripts called for the Enterprise crew to travel down to planets aboard a shuttlecraft, but building and filming a full landing sequence in every episode would have devoured the show's already thin budget. Instead, the production team came up with a far cheaper illusion. Actors would simply vanish in a shimmer of light. The effect was created using little more than glitter, careful lighting, and a film technique that layered the sparkling particles over the actors before fading them out. It cost almost nothing to produce, and it became one of the most iconic images in science fiction history. 4. The first pilot was rejected as too slow. Television networks rarely give a show a second chance after a failed pilot, but Star Trek's first attempt, an episode that would later be known as The Cage, was deemed too slow-moving and cerebral for a general television audience. NBC also reportedly bristled at the idea of a strong female second-in-command aboard the ship, a role that pushed against expectations for 1960s television. Rather than abandoning the project, Gene Roddenberry reworked the concept entirely, introducing new characters, a punchier tone, and a captain with a bit more swagger. The original pilot wasn't wasted, though. Years later, its footage was folded into a 2-part episode that used a clever narrative frame to justify reusing the old material, and that episode went on to win one of science fiction's most prestigious honors. 5. Uhura almost left the show. Nichelle Nichols played Lieutenant Uhura, a communications officer whose mere presence on the bridge was a quiet act of defiance against the norms of 1960s network television. Despite the significance of the role, Nichols grew frustrated with how little the character was given to do and considered leaving the series after its first season to pursue a career on Broadway. According to accounts she gave later in life, a chance encounter at a public event changed her mind. A prominent civil rights leader reportedly told her that the image of a black woman serving with authority and dignity on a spaceship mattered more than she realized, especially to a generation of children watching at home. She withdrew her resignation and stayed with the show. 6. Nimoy feared the ears would ruin his career. Leonard Nimoy is inseparable from the character of Spock today, but during production, he had real doubts about taking on the role. He worried that the pointed ears and alien features would make him look ridiculous rather than compelling, and that audiences might see a monster instead of a nuanced character. There was also the challenge of the performance itself. Nimoy was a trained actor accustomed to expressing emotion, and Spock demanded the opposite, a controlled, logical stillness that had to convey depth without ever breaking into visible feeling. It took time, but audiences responded to exactly the qualities Nimoy feared would work against him. The tension between logic and buried emotion became the character's defining trait. 7. The interracial kiss sparked a network battle. A scene involving Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura sharing a kiss became one of the most talked-about moments in the show's run, cited for decades as a landmark moment for interracial representation on American television. Behind the scenes, network executives were nervous about backlash, particularly from stations in the American South, and pushed for the scene to be framed as something forced upon the characters rather than a genuine choice, using an in-story device to soften the moment for cautious affiliates. Reports from the set suggest the actors weren't entirely willing to let the moment be diluted, and the version that made it to air carried more warmth and intention than the network had originally wanted. Viewers noticed, and for some, it left a lasting impression on how they saw the world. 8. Fans saved the show more than once. Star Trek never posted spectacular ratings, and after its first and second seasons, network executives seriously considered cancellation. What happened next had almost no precedent in television history. Viewers organized letter-writing campaigns on a massive scale, flooding network offices with mail, and even staging small demonstrations outside studio buildings, all without the benefit of the internet or social media. The pressure worked, not once but twice, convincing the network to renew the series against its own instincts. The third season that resulted was underfunded and poorly scheduled, and it would ultimately be the show's last, but it added just enough episodes to make the series viable for television syndication, the very thing that would later turn Star Trek into a cultural phenomenon. 9. The Enterprise model had a secret underside. The physical model used to represent the USS Enterprise in filming was an impressively detailed piece of craftsmanship, at least on the parts visible to the camera. Because every shot was framed from angles that showed the top or sides of the ship, the underside of the model was left largely unfinished, with visible seams, unpainted sections, and rough construction that no viewer was ever meant to see. It's a small, practical secret hiding inside one of the most recognizable spacecraft designs in fiction, preserved today for anyone curious enough to look underneath the museum display that houses the original model. 10. The most famous line was never actually said. Ask almost anyone to quote Star Trek, and they'll likely offer some version of "Beam me up, Scotty." It's printed on merchandise, referenced in other media, and instantly recognizable across generations. There's just one problem. That exact phrase never appears in the original series. Characters say close variations constantly, phrases like "Scotty, beam me up," or "Enterprise, beam me up," but the precise combination that became a cultural catchphrase was never spoken on screen. It's a strange quirk of collective memory, one shared by other famous misquotes in film history, where the popular version of a line outlives the actual one. 11. Alien costumes were often recycled wardrobe. Weekly encounters with strange civilizations demanded a constant stream of alien fashion, something the show's costume department managed with remarkable resourcefulness rather than an enormous budget. Studios in that era maintained massive wardrobe archives built up from decades of film and television productions, and Star Trek's costume designers frequently pulled from these existing stockpiles. A robe originally built for a historical epic might reappear, repainted and reworked as ceremonial alien dress. A costume from an old adventure film could be modified with new trim and insignia to suggest a distant world. It was inventive recycling dressed up as imagination, and on a television screen, the illusion held. 12. The iconic phaser started as a toy. The phaser, Starfleet's standard sidearm, became one of the most recognized prop weapons in science fiction, but its origins were far less glamorous than its reputation suggests. The prop department began with inexpensive plastic ray gun toys already sitting in a studio inventory, then modified them with new paint, added detailing, and small mechanical touches to make them look more sophisticated. Under close inspection, the plastic construction and slightly odd proportions gave away its humble roots, but on camera, paired with the right lighting and sound design, it looked like genuine advanced technology. Decades later, real-world research into directed energy weapons would draw direct conceptual inspiration from the prop. 13. Tribbles caused a real electrical problem. The beloved episode featuring small, furry, rapidly multiplying creatures called Tribbles is remembered as one of the show's most charming installments, but production of the episode came with an unexpected hazard. The turboprops were built from synthetic fur stretched over foam, and some contained small internal motors to simulate a soft purring vibration. Under the intense heat of studio lighting, the synthetic material built up significant static electricity, causing the props to cling to costumes, furniture, and camera equipment, and giving crew members small shocks during handling. The production team had to develop a system for discharging the props between takes just to get through filming safely. 14. A color of uniform became a grim joke. Longtime fans of the show are familiar with a dark bit of internet-era humor, the idea that any minor character wearing a red uniform on an away mission is essentially doomed. The show's color-coded uniform system assigned red to engineering and security personnel, the crew members most often sent into dangerous situations on unfamiliar planets. Over time, viewers noticed a pattern in which these background characters suffered a disproportionate number of on-screen deaths compared to other departments. The show never called attention to this itself, but audiences absorbed the pattern episode by episode, and it eventually became a piece of shorthand used well beyond science fiction fandom, showing up in conversations about storytelling, risk, and expendable characters in all kinds of media. 15. The Klingon weren't originally the main villains. Modern audiences tend to think of the Klingon as Star Trek's defining antagonists, but in the original series, they were a relatively late addition and not the primary adversary. That distinction initially belonged to the Romulans, introduced in an early episode widely regarded as one of the strongest of the series, who were written as secretive, calculating, and driven by a rigid sense of honor, evoking Cold War tensions of the era. The Klingon appeared later as a more overtly aggressive threat and grew into a much larger cultural presence through subsequent films and television series. The original show's villain landscape was more layered and less centered on a single recurring enemy than most casual fans remember. 16. Kirk's heroism was built against the computer. Captain Kirk's reputation as a leader who trusts instinct over cold calculation wasn't a coincidence of writing style. It was a deliberate narrative structure used repeatedly throughout the series. Episodes often set up situations where the ship's computer calculated grim odds or declared a course of action impossible, only for Kirk to override that judgment and succeed anyway. This wasn't just a plot device, it was a pointed argument the show kept making at a moment when computers were just beginning to enter public consciousness about the value of human judgment, intuition, and moral courage over pure calculation. That same tension between machine logic and human decision-making feels especially relevant now, in an era shaped by real debates about artificial intelligence. 17. Social commentary was hidden in alien makeup. Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to do more than entertain. He wanted it to comment on contemporary issues, but direct references to civil rights, the Vietnam War, or Cold War politics risked being cut by cautious network censors in the politically tense atmosphere of the late 1960s. The solution was to disguise those arguments as science fiction. One especially direct episode featured a humanoid species locked in generations of hatred over which side of their face was black and which was white, an allegory that left little to the imagination once viewers thought about it. Other episodes tackled war profiteering, blind political loyalty, and extremism, all filtered through alien societies and distant star systems. It allowed the show to smuggle pointed social criticism past gatekeepers who were far less likely to object to a metaphor than a headline. 18. The cast recorded a bizarre holiday album. Amid the drama and social commentary, the cast also took part in something considerably less serious, a holiday-themed recording session that produced one of the strangest artifacts in the show's history. Cast members lent their voices to seasonal songs and spoken-word pieces in a style that ranged from earnestly sincere to unintentionally comedic. It wasn't intended as a major commercial release, more a novelty project for archives and devoted fans, and it largely disappeared from public view for years afterward. Eventually, copies began circulating among collectors, and what started as an obscure curiosity slowly built a small cult following of its own, a reminder that even a groundbreaking science fiction show had room for pure, unguarded silliness. 19. The budget was almost unbelievably small. Everything discussed so far, the makeup, the sets, the model spacecraft, the special effects, came out of a production budget that was strikingly modest even by the standards of 1960s television. Sets were reused and redressed constantly to create the illusion of dozens of different planets and starships. Costumes were repurposed again and again. Effects that looked expensive on screen were often achieved through simple, low-cost techniques executed with careful lighting and editing. The show's creative team became experts in stretching limited resources into something that felt vast and imaginative, proving that constraint, more often than not, breeds ingenuity rather than limiting it. 20. Its cancellation wasn't the end of the story. When the network finally canceled the series in 1969 after a poorly supported third season, it looked, by every conventional measure, like a failure. Ratings had never been strong, the budget had been slashed, and the show had spent its final stretch buried in a difficult time slot. But the modest catalog of episodes it left behind turned out to be exactly enough for television syndication, and reruns introduced the show to an audience far larger than anything it had reached during its original broadcast. Conventions grew. A devoted fan culture formed almost from nothing. Eventually, feature films, spin-off series, and a media franchise spanning decades emerged from what had once been considered a canceled, underperforming television show. Few pieces of pop culture history illustrate as clearly how a show can fail in the moment and still shape the future for generations to come. From a rejected pilot to a franchise that has spanned nearly 60 years, the story of Star Trek's original run is really a story about scarcity turned into invention. A show with almost no money, working under constant threat of cancellation, still managed to introduce ideas, images, and even entire vocabulary words that outlive the era that produced them. The next time someone jokes about a red shirt, quotes a line that was never actually said, or imagines teleporting instead of driving to work, they're carrying forward a piece of scrappy, underfunded television show that had absolutely no business becoming as influential as it did.